Hello, my name is Britt Frank, and I'm a licensed neuropsychotherapist and author of The Science of Stuck and Align Your Mind. In the arrogance and hubris of youth, I remember being a teenager, being in college, and saying, if someone ever laid a hand on me, I would be out the door. I would never tolerate being physically abused in a relationship. As it turns out, I ended up being someone in a very, very violent history of romantic relationships. Because what I did not know then, that I have since learned now, is that number one, domestic abuse is not about a strong person or a weak person. And domestic abuse doesn't start from zero to being hit. It comes on slowly. It's that age-old frog in a pot of water situation where your self-esteem is eroded to the point that by the time the physical abuse begins, you feel you're not actually broken, but you feel so broken and devalued and worthless that it begins to make sense. If you haven't gone through it, it's hard to understand it. But I think we can all relate to the feeling of suddenly out of nowhere, things began to boil, and suddenly I'm in a situation that I have no idea how I got into, nor do I have any idea how to get out. As someone who's also in recovery from chemical addiction, from drug addiction, it was helpful to have had a little bit of recovery, not a lot. I had some fits and starts in the recovery process, and I wasn't conscious of it, but I was in the same type of addictive cycle as drug addiction. And domestic violence does become its own addictive cycle, which sounds a little weird. But this cycle of peace and love, and then the slow tension build, and then the escalation to a violent incident, and then the apology and the drama. It becomes this very, very dramatic cycle that's really hard to get off of. And to our brains, it does the same thing as drug addiction or chemical addiction. But I had dabbled in recovery enough at that point that I knew I needed support. It wasn't like a light bulb moment that got me out. I tried to leave once, I tried to leave twice. And the stats actually show that it does take women an average of 7 times to get out of violent relationships. And it probably took me 7 to 10 times of attempting to leave before I could finally get out. And it was awful. And I was still showing up for work every day and smiling and doing my good work that I do in the world. And behind closed doors, things were a mess. And that went on for years and years and years. And then when I finally got out, the thing that kept me from going back in. And the thing that really helped me grow was something I was so offended by when I was told, and again, my disclaimer here for anyone listening, I'm speaking for me. I am not the poster child for all domestic violence people who are in, this is just my story. I did not have any reason why I couldn't leave other than my own trauma and my own brain. Financially, I wasn't dependent. There were no children involved. And so I could leave and I didn't. And I remember when someone said that to me, I was like, I am sitting here covered in bruises and I am a victim. I am not someone who has a choice here. And the person said, you were victimized. That's true. And that's not your fault. And domestic abuse is never the fault of the person being abused. However, you're making a choice to stay. But when I was able to swallow that very bitter medicine, then I realized that's where my power is. That's where my agency is. By owning my part in participating in that dynamic, it wasn't diminishing my power, it was enhancing it. And from that very offensive nugget of truth, I was able to reconstruct my own sense of self and rebuild my life. I learned that if I was hell-bent on outsourcing my problems to someone else and blame, there will never be a shortage of people to do that. So until I was willing to stand in my own muck and my own mess and go, I am not a bad person and I am not a broken person, but I have made some choices that have contributed to this situation, and I have the power to make choices to get out of it. And again, I recognize not everyone has the same access to resources or the same privilege or the same choices that I did. But for me, it was when I realized that I have agency and choice in even the most horrifying situation, even accessing a microscopic sense of choice can change everything. And that's a principle, fortunately, I have not had to repeat in such a dramatic fashion. But the idea that even in adversity, there's usually at least one choice point, even if that's the choice for how I'm going to talk to myself in the middle of it. And when we can access our choices, things change. There's a Viktor Frankl quote that I really love, and it's, in between stimulus and response, there's a space, and in that space is our freedom to choose. And so I would encourage anyone, don't forget to ask yourself, what are my choices? For me, I didn't like my choices, but not liking my choices is not the same as not having any. And so in the middle of whatever you're going through, ask yourself, I may not like any of my options, but I need to start with I have some, and I'm going to list them and I'm going to name them. And then it's of those options, am I willing to do any of them today? And if you're not, okay, I was not willing to do things for a long time, but it's what are my choices of those? What am I willing to do? And if you can't find a willingness point, then make your choices smaller. You might not be willing to do the big thing, but maybe you can do the small thing. I call it the micro yes. My micro yes was I hadn't eaten in days and I was on a drug bender and there was a domestic violence cycle that was going on. And I called a friend and she's like, Britt, when was the last time you ate food? And I was like, it's been days. And I sat there on the phone with her eating a yogurt for an hour. And sometimes the bravest thing you'll do all day is eat the yogurt. And whatever that version is for you, from those teeny tiny microscopic yeses come huge, impossible to believe, but very, very real transformations. If you have a brain, it's never too late. We know from neuroscience that the brain is always growing and learning and changing. And so, this idea of, well, this is who I am today, so this is how I'm going to be forever, is just not biologically accurate. If you're listening to this, if you have a pulse, if you have a brain, you're not done and things can change.